Welcome to the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy's Kentucky Energy Infrastructure Hazard Risk Awareness Mapping application. I'm Kenya Stump, Executive Director of the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy. And this is a preview of a mapping experience using GIS to look at hazard risk as it pertains to Kentucky's energy infrastructure. The Kentucky Office of Energy Policy is the state's energy office responsible for overseeing Kentucky's Energy Assurance Plan. A component of that plan is understanding hazard risk and all hazard risk as it applies to Kentucky's energy infrastructure. You'll see here just the base map of Kentucky. I don't have any of the layers turned on yet. Here at the upper right-hand corner are the map layers. And you can see we have our energy infrastructure broken down by electricity, natural gas, hydrocarbon liquids, crude oil, petroleum, coal, and oil and gas data sets that are combined, alternative and renewable fuels. And then later on, we'll talk about our vulnerable areas and energy usage data, as well as get into our hazard risk. Our energy infrastructure data is pulled from two primary sources. One is the U.S. Energy Atlas from the Energy Information Administration. And for those of you with GIS experience, or who have staff with GIS experience or contractors you're using for GIS, EIA provides Energy Atlas data in formats that enable state energy offices to develop their own state-specific energy infrastructure maps without looking at the entire United States. The other data set we use is the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data as well. This is a nice data set to one, supplement EIA's Energy Atlas, but also bring in some other data points that we may be interested in terms of critical facilities. But going back to our infrastructure hazard risk awareness mapping experience, you can see electricity. You can turn these layers on and off by clicking the eye. There's our transmission. And I didn't turn off the nationwide layers on this one or filter it just for Kentucky, because it was important to kind of show how our transmission system interacts with our surrounding states. We also have our electric service areas, so I can see which territories are served by our utilities in the state. And we also have our power plants as well. Similarly, on natural gas, hydrocarbon gas pipelines, our natural gas pipelines come in as well when we want to visualize those. Moving on to crude oil and petroleum, we have terminals, pumping stations, our refineries, petroleum product pipelines, and our crude oil pipelines, just to give you an example. And you can click the little triangle to expand the layers as well. Coal and oil and gas combined, our coal mines, as well as our oil and natural gas interconnects and our oil and natural gas wells. On alternative and renewable fuels, ethanol, biodiesel, and non-gasoline alternative fueling stations pop up as well. And when those pop up, you can click on one of those and it gives you details. This is a feral gas, propane, and it gives its address, access, operating hours, all kinds of information, and you can also click here to zoom to it. I'm going to turn off our alternative fuel. Before I go into vulnerable areas and energy usage, let's go into hazard risk. So for hazard risk, I'm expanding this. We reference and utilize FEMA's National Risk Index for Natural Hazards. It is a mapping data tool, data sets from FEMA that identifies communities most at risk to 18 natural hazards. And the risk index for natural hazards looks at expected annual loss from natural hazards, social vulnerability, and community resilience. It's at the county and census tract level, and it's made available via GIS for when you do custom analysis. If you're interested on where this comes in, FEMA, here's the address at the top. Here's where you can look for the national risk indexes. I think it's very interesting because of where we are at the State Energy Office. You can use the National Risk Index when we're looking at emergency operations plans, enhancing hazard mitigation plans. For us, with our energy assurance plan, prioritizing and allocating resources, identifying the need for more refined risk assessments. We're going to be working here in Kentucky, encouraging community level risk communication and engagement. Of course, a big focus is education and outreach. And how this supports basically our long-term preparedness in the energy office and in the state of Kentucky. So let's go back to our map. And as many of you know, we just had a tornado, a very devastating tornado this past December. So I'm going to expand on the tornado annualized frequency. So this is the risk index for tornado. It's at the census tract, you can see. And it does pull in areas of our state. When I look at the county level, that show and did experience our most recent tornado event in this past December. What I like about the risk indexes is that they go through several different hazards. So another one we experience here is ice storms. And again, we see western part of the state all the way to the east as a potential risk there. But then also for those high impact, low frequency events, we can, like an earthquake, we know we have specific areas of our state that are at risk for these types of events as well. So it's a great tool for quickly visualizing. For instance, I can turn on the tornado. I'm going to look at the census tract, but then I'm going to go up to electricity infrastructure and look at transmission lines. And then I'm immediately able to visualize, okay, what's the utility serving these areas? Here are some areas of the state where we may want to prioritize or concentrate resources as it relates to infrastructure, being more prepared for these annualized events, building back better so that we can prevent loss when we have recurrence of these natural disasters. So that's one risk index. So, and like I said, there are plenty of more here as well. For instance, wildfire. We are at an increased risk for wildfire due to our natural resources in the eastern part of the state. So again, this is something we can take into account as we look at our energy infrastructure. So I'm going to close up those hazard risks And then I'm going to go look at vulnerable areas and energy usage. This is also a component of energy assurance planning, is where are our at-risk populations. One thing that I like to look at first is I like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And I'm going to look at the overall SVI. And the darker areas, by the way, if you ever want to see the legend's here. So up at the top next to the mapping, so you can see the legend. The darker areas are more vulnerable. This tracks with what we know about our population characteristics. For the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, it really refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health. Those stressors can include natural or human-caused disasters. So this is a nice companion index to show, okay, well, in addition to those areas that may be at risk for certain disasters, they're also socially vulnerable as well, meaning they may not be able to recover as quickly when a disaster affects those areas. This is also a way that we can look at where to direct resources, including potential funding and projects that can impact those counties to maybe lessen or reduce the social vulnerability in these areas, or reduce the impacts on the energy infrastructure due to natural hazards and disasters that can affect these populations. So that's one indicator of vulnerability. The other one is FEMA also has a county aggregate resilience indicator. And what that is FEMA looks at community resilience at the aggregate county level, and community resilience is the ability of community to prepare for anticipated natural hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. So we just saw where there are social vulnerability. The darker areas mean that they actually have low resilience, and those often overlap with the same areas that have high social vulnerability but low community resilience. And low community resilience is indicated by the darker colors here. If you'd like more information on that, FEMA at this address does an aggregate community resilience indicator. And as I just said, a community resilience score is inversely proportional to a community's risk. So higher community resilience score results in a lower risk index score. So back to our map of our energy infrastructure. So that's helping us look at vulnerable areas and resilience across our state. But that's not the only vulnerable areas. We also are concerned when we have a hazard risk and we're building back infrastructure where there may be critical habitat for threatened or endangered species, or where we have unprotected areas of high biodiversity that we may want to be sensitive to as well. Another indicator that I like to look at is the ACS Housing Tenure by heating fuel. When we do have a response to an event, this tells us, as I zoom in, I'm going to zoom in here to Owensboro area, and then I'm going to turn on my legend. Yellow are occupied housing units, which are heated mostly by gas. Blue is electricity, and the shading is the degree of kind kind of the increase, meaning the darker areas has more of that particular fuel. And then green is propane. So this is also important when we're looking at how do we prepare for certain areas of the state that may be dependent on fuels during an event or when or more at risk, and how does that affect the infrastructure? So here we know we have areas of the state that if we have a natural gas disruption, we know the specific pockets of the state that are dependent on that for home heating. If we have a propane supply disruption, we can see those areas of the state as well. And so we'll zoom, and you can always click the home button to recenter. And then if we did want to search an area of the state, the spyglass, I'm going to look at Frankfort, Kentucky. And it zooms right in. And so at Frankfort, we can see we have electricity and natural gas used for home heating. Going back to home, we recenter and our map layers. I'm going to turn that off. And so that's our brief tutorial of our mapping experience. It really gives us our hazard risk awareness at the tips of our fingertips. At the tips of our fingertips. It really has given us the ability to visualize our hazards in a way that we haven't been able to before, and also in relation to our energy infrastructure in the state. Then we can also look at, well, what are our vulnerable areas, those that are low in community resilience, and how does that play into our energy assurance planning, as well as potential funding, and how that could be prioritized and allocated across the state. One thing I wanted to show on hazard risk is we are fortunate in Kentucky that we have electricity reliability data at the circuit level through data that's submitted to our Public Service Commission. When we look at our reliability, what I call hotspots, that by no means indicates that we have low reliability of our electricity system across the state. It just means we have areas of the state where they may have increased occurrences of outages. That's above maybe the average for that particular area or those circuits. So when we look at that, we can see these are what I call reliability hotspots, but it just means that they're at an increased prevalence of having either interruptions or outages, either man-made or due to those natural hazards. And you can see that oftentimes these hotspots do coincide with, for instance, areas of the state that experience high winds or tornadoes or winter weather, strong winds, ice storms. And we also see those areas of the state where the terrain is particularly difficult and makes maybe that infrastructure a little bit more vulnerable to outages when we have an event, a natural event occur. Another thing we like to look at is this is our historical tornado track. So I know we had the index, FEMA's index of annualized risk, but this also helps us visualize our historical tornado tracks, and we did a density analysis on it, and it does track very well with where we have seen major losses in our state due to tornado events. And this also gives us an indication of where we may want to look at more robust infrastructure, whether that be through our utilities, through local codes, building codes, energy efficiency, or looking at our other services in the area that can support increased community resilience and decrease that social vulnerability of these areas. In terms of data, here's where you can go to find the National Risk Index for Natural Hazards. You can access the National Risk Index. If you don't have GIS experience in your staff, they have a nice interactive map. It also gives you information about social vulnerability as well as community resilience. And what else do we have today? But FEMA is not the only community resilience estimate. United States Census has a great interactive tool where you can look at community resilience estimates for your state. Let's see if I can get to Kentucky here. So when we look at Kentucky, this is the thematic risk factor for 2019. And this really means if you have zero risk, but if you have estimated population with 3+ risk factors. And for this community resilience estimate, they look at income and poverty, if you're a single caregiver household, communication, barrier, disability, age, if you have vehicle access, broadband or internet access. So they take a lot of factors into consideration, as well as FEMA does as well in the Community Resilience Index and social vulnerability as well. But back to Kentucky's tool. This is our tool. You have the ability to change your base map here. You can do measurements. You can look at layers and legends. You can zoom into certain spots. You can always go back to your default map view. I hope you've enjoyed a quick tour through our hazard risk awareness mapping experience. We're always looking for ways that we can improve it or find better data sets. But this is how we're approaching our hazard risk analysis, or all hazards risk analysis. What I do like before I leave on the national index for the National Risk Index is going back to the overall map is they do an all hazards risk index. So if I'm looking at all hazards and I zoom into Kentucky and I look at the census tract level, I really can see at a census tract level where when I'm looking across all hazards, where I have that increased annualized frequency of those natural hazard risks. And this is a good way if you're looking at an all hazards approach and then overlaying this data set with your energy infrastructure layers to see how you can start working with your energy stakeholders and communities in these areas to talk not just about top down in terms of what the service providers can do in the community, but again, as FEMA said, how can communities work within their mitigation plans or their emergency operations plan to look at their energy infrastructure in terms of these all hazard risks. So thanks for joining us. If you have questions, you can email us here at the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy at energy@ky.gov. We'd love to get your feedback, and if you'd like to talk to us further, feel free to reach out. And that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening.